It is the winter of 1961, and a woman is standing inside a small Parisian gallery on the left bank. She is beautiful, elegantly dressed, and holding a .22 caliber rifle. Behind her, a crowd of well-dressed Parisians is watching, some of them with champagne glasses still in their hands. In front of her hangs a large white panel covered in thick plaster, and hidden beneath that plaster are dozens of small bags filled with paint in every color you can imagine. Red, blue, yellow, black. She raises the rifle, takes aim, and fires. The first shot sends a crack echoing off the gallery walls, and a burst of brilliant red begins bleeding through the white surface like a wound opening. The crowd gasps. She fires again, blue this time, running in streaks down the face of the panel. Again and again. By the time she sets the rifle down, the white surface has become a violent, gorgeous explosion of color, and the audience is applauding like they have just witnessed something sacred. Because in a way, they have. Her name was Niki de Saint-Phal, and what she had just done was not merely fire bullets into plaster. She had murdered painting. She had killed the old way of making art right there in front of everyone, and she had made it look thrilling. But her story, and how she ended up holding that rifle, is far more complicated and far more painful than anyone in that room could have guessed. And she was just one thread in a web of artists, filmmakers, radicals, and dreamers who turned 1960s Paris into the most creatively dangerous city on earth. Tonight, we are going to walk through the hidden side of that city, not the Paris of postcards and perfume advertisements, not the Paris of the Eiffel Tower lit up at night, or lovers strolling along the Seine. We are going to the other Paris, the one that smelled of turpentine and cheap wine and printer's ink, the one where filmmakers shot entire movies on the sidewalks with borrowed cameras, where philosophers sat in smoky cafes arguing until 3 in the morning about whether reality itself was a lie, where a tiny group of radical thinkers wrote slogans so powerful they would one day be spray-painted across the walls of the entire city during the largest general strike in the history of the Western world. And beneath all of it, literally beneath the streets, hundreds of kilometers of forbidden tunnels where yet another kind of underground art was being born in the dark. This is the story of 1960s Paris and the secret world of art, rebellion, and revolution that most people never hear about. So close your eyes if you like, and let me take you there. To understand what was happening in Paris in the early 1960s, you first have to understand a wound. Not a physical wound, though the city still bore plenty of those from the war. This was a wound to the pride, to the identity, to the very soul of a place that had considered itself the undisputed center of the art world for centuries. Because by the time the 1950s were drawing to a close, Paris had a problem. It was no longer the capital of modern art. That title had been quietly, decisively stolen, and the thief was 3,000 miles away, across the Atlantic, in New York City. For generations, Paris had been the place where art happened. If you were a painter, a sculptor, a writer, a musician with serious ambitions, Paris was where you went. It had been that way since the Impressionists set up their easels along the banks of the Seine in the 1870s. It had been that way through Picasso and Braque shattering reality into geometric fragments in their Montmartre studios before the First World War. It had been that way through the Surrealists and the Dadaists and the wild experiments of the 1920s and 1930s. Even during the Nazi occupation, when the city was suffocating under the boot of the German army, artists had continued to work in secret, had continued to dream, had continued to insist that beauty and meaning could survive even in the darkest of times. And when the war finally ended and the last German soldiers withdrew and the church bells rang across Paris for the first time in 4 years, artists flooded back. They came from everywhere. From Spain, from Italy, from Eastern Europe, from North Africa, from South America. More than 350 artists were working in Paris in the years right after the liberation, all of them drawn by the city's legendary reputation, all of them certain that this was where the next great chapter of art history would be written. And for a while, it seemed like they were right. A loose group of painters who would come to be known as the Second School of Paris were producing extraordinary work. Men like Pierre Solages, who created canvases of such deep, rich blackness that they seemed to absorb the light around them. Hans Hartung, a German-born painter who had lost a leg fighting for the French Foreign Legion and who made paintings that felt like seismographs of human emotion, all scratches and trembling lines. Zhao Woqi, a Chinese émigré who had arrived in Paris in 1948 and was creating canvases where Eastern and Western traditions blurred into something entirely new, landscapes that seemed to exist in some space between reality and dream. There was also a fierce critical debate raging through the galleries and the magazines and the café tables of Paris. New labels were being invented almost weekly to describe what these artists were doing. Art informel, tachisme, lyrical abstraction. The terms overlapped and contradicted each other, and the artists themselves often hated the labels being pinned to their work. But beneath all the arguing, there was a shared conviction that Paris was still the place where the future of art was being decided. The problem was that it wasn't. Not anymore. In New York, something enormous had happened. A group of American painters, many of them deeply influenced by the European refugees who had fled to America during the war, had created a movement so powerful and so new that it shifted the center of gravity of the entire art world almost overnight. Abstract expressionism. Jackson Pollock dripping and flinging paint onto canvases laid flat on the floor of his Long Island barn. Willem de Kooning attacking his surfaces with a ferocity that made the canvas feel like a battlefield. Mark Rothko stacking luminous rectangles of color that could make grown men cry for reasons they could not quite explain. These painters were not politely extending a European tradition. They were rewriting the rules entirely. And the American galleries, the American critics, the American collectors, and most importantly, the American money, were all rallying behind them. This was more than an artistic shift. It was a geopolitical one. In the cold calculus of the Cold War, modern art had become a weapon. The United States government, through organizations like the Congress for Cultural Freedom, was actively promoting abstract expressionism as proof that American culture was dynamic, free, and forward-looking, in contrast to the dreary socialist realism being produced under Soviet control. The irony that some of these abstract expressionists held left-wing sympathies was conveniently overlooked. What mattered was the message. America was the future, Paris was the past, and Parisians felt it. The galleries on the left bank could sense the shift. The collectors, who had once fought over paintings by Solages and Hartung, were now flying to New York to buy Pollocks and Rothkos. The critical attention was drifting westward. The invitations to major international exhibitions were going to American artists first, Parisians second. It was a slow humiliation, and it stung. But here is the thing about wounded cities. They do not simply accept their fate. The most interesting ones fight back. And the way Paris fought back in the late 1950s and early 1960s was not by trying to outdo the abstract expressionists at their own game. It was by rejecting the game entirely, by declaring that painting on canvas, the whole tradition of a single artist standing alone before a rectangular surface and trying to express something profound, was finished, dead, over, and that something entirely new had to take its place. This rebellion did not come from the older generation, the Solages and Hartungs, who were still producing beautiful work. It came from a younger generation of artists who had grown up in the ruins of the war, who had watched their parents' world collapse, and who had no interest in propping up traditions they considered exhausted. These young artists were restless, angry, and brilliantly inventive, and they were about to tear the Paris art world apart. But they did not do it from gleaming galleries or well-lit studios. They did it from back alleys and basements, from condemned buildings and borrowed rooms, from cafe tables where they argued until the waiters threw them out at dawn. They did it from the margins, from the underground, from the shadows. And the first place you have to go to understand what they created is a neighborhood that in those years was the closest thing the modern world had to a creative nerve center. A handful of streets on the south bank of the Seine, where the density of genius per square foot was probably higher than anywhere else on the planet. The neighborhood was called Saint-Germain-des-Prés, and if you had walked through it on a warm evening in 1960 or 1961, you would have stepped into a world that no longer exists anywhere. The neighborhood sat in the 6th arrondissement, tucked between the Luxembourg Gardens to the south and the river to the north, and it had been the intellectual heart of Paris for centuries. The name came from an old Benedictine abbey founded in the 6th century, and the ancient bell tower of the church of Saint-Germain-des-Prés still stood watch over the neighborhood like a stern grandfather keeping an eye on unruly grandchildren, because unruly was putting it mildly. For as long as anyone could remember, this small stretch of the left bank had attracted writers and thinkers and troublemakers. Voltaire and Rousseau had argued here in the 1700s. Oscar Wilde had drunk himself into oblivion here in the 1890s. In the 1920s and 1930s, the neighborhood's cafes had been filled with the likes of Picasso and Hemingway and Gertrude Stein, and after the war, Saint-Germain-des-Prés had become the global headquarters of existentialism, that brooding philosophical movement built around the idea that human existence has no inherent meaning and that we are all condemned to be free. The two names most associated with existentialism, Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, had essentially lived in the neighborhood's cafes during the 1940s and 1950s. Sartre reportedly arrived at the Café de Flore at 9 in the morning and worked until noon. Then he and Beauvoir would go somewhere for lunch, return to the café by 2 in the afternoon, work until dinner, and then come back again for a nightcap. They wrote entire books at those marble-topped tables. Sartre's masterwork, Being and Nothingness, was largely composed at the floor, surrounded by cigarette smoke and the clink of coffee cups, and the low hum of 100 other conversations. Just across the Boulevard Saint-Germain from the floor was Les Deux Magots, the other legendary café, which had been an intellectual gathering place since the 1880s and had established its own literary prize in 1933. Albert Camus had been a regular. So had the poet Jacques Prévert and the sculptor Alberto Giacometti, whose impossibly thin bronze figures seemed to embody the existentialist sense of human isolation. But by the early 1960s, something was shifting in the neighborhood. The philosophers were aging. Sartre was still writing, still arguing, still chain-smoking his way through every waking hour. But the white-hot cultural energy that had made Saint-Germain the most exciting neighborhood in Europe was being claimed by new arrivals. And these new arrivals were not philosophers. They were filmmakers and fashion designers and jazz musicians and painters who wanted nothing to do with easels. The Café de Flore, which had once belonged to the existentialists, was now filling up with faces from the French New Wave cinema scene. Brigitte Bardot would appear and the whole room would shift. Roman Polanski, young and intense, would be huddled in conversation with someone at a corner table. Yves Saint Laurent, who had just taken over the house of Dior at the astonishing age of 21, was a regular, and so was his rival Hubert de Givenchy and the formidable Karl Lagerfeld. The café had become a place where intellectual gravity was being replaced by glamour, where the deep conversations about the meaning of existence were giving way to conversations about the meaning of the next film, the next collection, the next opening night. And below the boulevard, quite literally beneath the streets, another world was thriving. The cellar clubs. Paris in the late 1950s and early 1960s had an extraordinary underground jazz scene, and some of the most important music in the world was being played in vaulted stone basements that you could only find if you knew which unmarked door to push open. The most famous of these was Le Club Saint-Germain, which had opened in 1948 after a trumpeter and writer named Boris Vian and some of his friends discovered a perfect vaulted cellar beneath a building on the Rue Saint-Benoît. They pooled their money, pulled in some financing from the owner of the Café de Flore, and opened a jazz club that would become legendary. Duke Ellington played there, Django Reinhardt played there, Miles Davis played there, and while he was in Paris, he fell into a passionate love affair with the singer and actress Juliette Gréco, who was known as the muse of existentialism and who moved through the neighborhood like a dark flame, all black clothes and enormous eyes, and a voice that could break your heart. The connection between Greco and Davis was significant in a way that went beyond romance. Davis, like many African-American artists and writers of that era, found in Paris a freedom from the suffocating racism of the United States. He could sit at any cafe table he liked. He could walk into any restaurant. He could be treated as what he was, one of the most brilliant musicians alive, rather than being reduced to the color of his skin. And he was not alone in feeling this way. Just south of the boulevard, near the Luxembourg Gardens, there was a smaller, quieter cafe called Café Tournant. It did not have the fame of the Fleur or Les Deux Magots, but it held a special place in the literary history of Paris. In the 1950s and into the early 1960s, Café Tournant had become a gathering place for African-American writers who had chosen to live in Paris. Richard Wright, the author of Native Son, was a regular. So was James Baldwin, who wrote much of his extraordinary novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, while drinking cognac and coffee on the second floor of the Café de Flore, but who spent his social hours at Tournon, surrounded by fellow expatriates. Chester Himes, who would go on to write some of the most vivid crime fiction set in Harlem, was part of this circle too. These men had come to Paris for the same reason artists had always come to Paris, because it promised freedom. But for them, the freedom was not merely creative, it was existential in the most literal sense. In Paris, they could exist as writers rather than as black writers. They could think about language and narrative and form without the constant grinding weight of American racial hatred pressing down on every thought. And so the neighborhood hummed with all of these overlapping worlds: philosophers and filmmakers, jazz musicians and fashion designers, American expatriates and European refugees, painters who had declared the death of painting, and sculptors who were building machines designed to destroy themselves. All of them crowded into a few streets of old stone buildings and narrow sidewalks, all of them spending more time in cafes than in their cold, cramped apartments. All of them convinced that whatever happened next in the history of human creativity was going to happen right here, in this neighborhood, on this side of the river, in this impossible, infuriating, magnificent city. And many of them were right, because what happened next would shake Paris to its foundations. It began, as so many revolutions do, with a small group of people signing a piece of paper in someone's living room. On the evening of October 27, 1969, people gathered in a small apartment in Paris. The apartment belonged to a 32-year-old artist named Yves Klein, and the 9 people who came through his door that night were about to do something that would send shockwaves through the art world. They were going to sign a document, just a few lines on a piece of paper. But those few lines amounted to a declaration of war against everything the art establishment held sacred. The document was called the Constitutive Declaration of New Realism, and it had been written by an art critic named Pierre Restany, a man with a sharp mind and an even sharper tongue who had been watching the younger generation of Parisian artists with growing excitement. Restany's thesis was simple and devastating. The old ways of making art were dead. Painting on canvas, sculpting in marble, the whole tradition of the artist as a solitary genius wrestling with beauty in a quiet studio, all of it was finished. What needed to replace it was something raw, something direct, something pulled from the real world and shoved into the face of the viewer without apology. The people who signed the declaration that night were a wildly diverse group. Klein was there, of course, the host and the movement's most charismatic figure. Jean Tinguely was there, a Swiss sculptor who built machines out of scrap metal and industrial junk that whirred and clanked and occasionally exploded. Arman was there, an artist who was becoming famous for filling glass cases with piles of garbage and calling the result art. Daniel Spoeri was there, a Romanian-born artist who would glue the remains of a dinner party, plates and glasses and leftover food and cigarette butts and all, to a board and hang it on the wall as what he called a trap picture, a frozen moment of ordinary reality, captured and preserved like an insect in amber. There were also 3 artists associated with an earlier movement called the ultra-lettrists. François Dufresne, Raymond Haynes, and Jacques de la Villègle. They worked with torn posters ripped from the streets of Paris, the shredded remains of advertisements and political notices that had been layered one on top of another on city walls, until they became accidental collages, gorgeous in their randomness. And then there was Marshall Race, who worked with neon lights and plastic objects and anything else that felt like it belonged to the bright, disposable consumer culture that was transforming post-war Europe. What bound these 9 people together was not a shared style. They painted nothing alike, they did not agree on technique or subject or even on what art was supposed to do. What bound them was a shared conviction that art had to stop hiding in galleries and start engaging with the messy, noisy, overwhelming reality of the modern world. They were going to make art out of what was actually around them, out of junk and noise and the detritus of consumer society, out of the real. Restaini called the movement Nouveau Realisme, New Realism, and at the center of it all, the beating heart of this new movement was the man in whose apartment they had gathered, Yves Klein. To understand Klein, you have to understand that he was not merely an artist. He was a force of nature operating on a different frequency from everyone around him. Born in Nice in 1928 to parents who were both painters, Klein had grown up surrounded by art, but had never received any formal training. Instead, he had spent his early 20s studying judo in Japan, where he earned a black belt, and immersing himself in the mystical teachings of the Rosicrucians, an esoteric spiritual order. He emerged from these experiences with a worldview that was part warrior, part mystic, and entirely his own. In the mid-1950s, Klein began exhibiting what he called monochromes, canvases painted in a single, uniform color. At first, he used different colors, but he became increasingly obsessed with blue. Not just any blue, a blue so deep, so saturated, so overwhelmingly intense that it seemed to pull you into it. He worked with a chemist to develop a special pigment suspended in a synthetic resin that preserved the raw brilliance of pure ultramarine without dulling it the way traditional binding agents did. In 1960, he patented this color. He called it International Klein Blue, and it became his signature, his obsession, his identity. But Klein's monochromes were only the beginning. In 1958, he staged an exhibition at the Galerie Iris Claret in Paris that remains one of the most audacious gestures in the history of art. He called it The Void. Visitors arrived at the gallery to find it completely empty. The walls were bare, there was nothing to look at. Klein's proposition was that the invisible, the immaterial, the space between things could itself be a work of art. It was either the most profound artistic statement of the decade or the most elaborate joke. Opinions varied wildly, which was exactly what Klein wanted. Then came the anthropometries. In 1960, Klein began creating paintings using the bodies of naked women as his paintbrushes. He would direct models to cover themselves in International Klein Blue paint, and then press or drag their bodies across large white canvases while he stood to one side in a tuxedo, conducting the performance like an orchestra maestro. These sessions were sometimes staged before live audiences, with a chamber ensemble playing Klein's own monotone symphony, a single sustained chord followed by 20 minutes of silence in the background. The anthropometries were controversial even at the time, and they remained so. Were they exploitative, reducing women to mere tools? Were they brilliant, turning the human body into a living paintbrush and the act of painting into a performance? Were they a commentary on the male artist's relationship to the female form? Klein himself was characteristically enigmatic about his intentions, preferring to let the work generate its own meanings. What is beyond dispute is that Klein had an extraordinary gift for turning every artistic act into an event, a spectacle, a moment that lodged in people's memories and refused to leave. He sold zones of immaterial pictorial sensibility, which is to say, he sold nothing at all, empty air, in exchange for gold, which he then threw into the Seine. He made sculptures out of fire. He made prints using the wind and rain as his collaborators, strapping canvases to the roof of his car and driving through storms. He was also, by all accounts, a man of immense personal charm, capable of convincing almost anyone of almost anything. His energy seemed inexhaustible. His ambitions seemed boundless. He wanted nothing less than to transcend the physical world entirely, to make art that existed beyond objects, beyond materials, beyond the limitations of matter itself. And then, without warning, he was gone. On June 6, 1962, at the age of 34, Yves Klein suffered a heart attack and died. He was at a film screening in Paris, watching a documentary in which his own work appeared, when he collapsed. He had suffered a previous heart attack just weeks earlier, but had refused to slow down, refused to rest, refused to stop. He left behind a body of work that was astonishing in its range and daring, and a void in the Parisian art world that nothing could fill. Klein's death devastated the Nouveau Realisme movement. He had been its brightest star, its most provocative voice, its center of gravity. Without him, the movement continued, but something essential had been lost. Restany kept writing manifestos. The other artists kept working, kept exhibiting, kept pushing boundaries. But the incandescent energy that Klein had brought to every room he entered, that strange mixture of spiritual intensity and showman's flair, was irreplaceable. Tinguely, for his part, responded to the loss in the way he always responded to things, by building machines. His sculptures were assemblages of wheels and motors and gears and belts, scavenged from junkyards and flea markets, contraptions that rattled and shook, and sometimes fell apart, which was exactly the point. His most famous work, Homage to New York, had been a massive, self-destroying machine that he constructed in the garden of the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1960. It was designed to destroy itself in a spectacular mechanical suicide. And it did, more or less, though a few components caught fire and the fire department had to be called. Tinguely considered this an improvement on his original plan. There was a dark comedy to Tinguely's machines that set them apart from anything else being made in Paris at the time. They were parodies of the industrial age, mechanical creatures that seemed to be laughing at the very idea of efficiency and progress. You would press a pedal and a motor would shudder to life, and the whole assemblage would begin to shake and rattle, feathers quivering, tin cans clanking, and for a moment the thing would seem almost alive, almost joyful, before grinding to a halt or shaking itself to pieces. The art critic at the Centre Pompidou later described the effect perfectly. What seemed incomplete and unsatisfying when motionless, when animated, became a bizarre enchantment. And then there was Arman. If Klein was the mystic of the group and Tinguely was the comedian, Arman was the archaeologist. He was fascinated by accumulation, by the sheer quantity of objects that modern consumer society produced and discarded. His signature works were clear resin boxes filled with identical objects, hundreds of the same thing packed together until the individual item lost its meaning and became something else entirely. Hundreds of gas masks, hundreds of alarm clocks, hundreds of faucets. The effect was both beautiful and disturbing, like looking at the physical evidence of a civilization drowning in its own excess. Arman also created what he called colères, or rages, in which he would take a familiar object, a violin, a chair, a television set, and violently smash it to pieces, then arrange the fragments on a canvas. It was destruction as creation, violence as art, and it resonated powerfully in a culture that was still processing the unimaginable destruction of the war. Daniel Spoeri's trap pictures, meanwhile, offered a gentler but equally radical challenge to traditional art. Imagine this. You have just finished a meal. The table is covered in the remains, a half-empty wineglass, a crumpled napkin, breadcrumbs, an ashtray with 3 cigarette butts, a stain where someone spilled coffee. Now imagine that someone glues every single one of those objects exactly where it sits, picks up the entire tabletop, turns it vertical, and hangs it on a gallery wall. That is a trap picture, a frozen moment of ordinary existence, preserved with the same care and reverence that a museum might show to a Renaissance painting. The genius of Spoeri's work was its radical democracy. It's said that this moment, this messy, unremarkable dinner between friends, is worthy of the same attention as any masterpiece. That the real world, in all its chaotic, stained, crumby glory, is itself a kind of art, if only you have the eyes to see it. But of all the artists who joined the Nouveau Realisme movement, none had a story quite as remarkable or quite as painful as the woman who walked into that gallery in 1961 and picked up a rifle. Niki de Saint-Phal was born in 1930 in a wealthy suburb of Paris called Neuilly-sur-Seine, but she grew up in New York where her family had relocated. On the surface, her childhood looked privileged. Beneath the surface, it was a house of horrors. When she was 11 years old, her father sexually abused her, a trauma that would haunt her for decades and that would eventually find its way transmuted and transfigured into some of the most powerful art of the 20th century. She did not speak publicly about this abuse until much later in life, but its shadow was present in everything she made. As a young woman, she worked as a model, appearing on the covers of Vogue and Life magazine. She married young, had 2 children, and tried to live the life that was expected of her. But something inside her was breaking. In her late 20s, she suffered a serious nervous breakdown and was hospitalized. It was during this period of crisis that she turned to art, not as a hobby or a diversion, but as a matter of survival. She had no formal training. She taught herself to paint, and almost immediately her work began to pulse with a raw, violent energy that stunned everyone who saw it. In 1960, she separated from her husband and moved in with Jean Tinguet, the Swiss sculptor with the self-destroying machines. It was a partnership that would define both of their lives, personally and artistically. They were wildly different personalities. Tinguely with his sardonic humor and his mechanical obsessions, Saint-Phal with her fierce intensity and her need to transform pain into beauty. But they recognized something in each other, a shared belief that art should not be polite, should not be tidy, should not sit quietly on a wall waiting to be admired. And then came the shooting paintings. The idea emerged almost accidentally. Saint-Phal had been making assemblages, sticking objects to boards and covering them in thick white plaster. But she wanted something more. She wanted violence. She wanted to attack the canvas itself, to make the act of creation into an act of destruction. And so she began embedding small bags of colored paint beneath the plaster and shooting at them with a rifle. The first staged public shooting took place in February of 1961 in the Impasse Ronsin, a trash-strewn cul-de-sac in the Montparnasse district of Paris. The Impasse Ronsin was an extraordinary place, a dead-end alley lined with improvised studios that had been home to some of the most radical artists in Paris. The great Romanian sculptor Constantin Brancusi had worked there. Tinguely had a studio there. Klein had used the space Max Ernst had passed through. It was the kind of place where genius and squalor lived side by side, where you could trip over a masterpiece on your way to the bathroom. And it was here, in this unlikely setting, that Saint-Phal first fired a rifle at a work of art in front of an audience. The response was electric. Pierre Restany, the founder of Nouveau Realisme, immediately asked Saint-Phal to join the movement. She became its only female member. Other shootings followed, growing in scale and ambition. At a gallery exhibition called Fire at Will at the Galerie J in 1961, viewers were invited to pick up the rifle themselves and fire at the works. The American artists Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg both took their turns pulling the trigger. The line between artist and audience had been obliterated. Everyone was complicit. Everyone was creating. Everyone was destroying. The shooting paintings were, in one sense, a commentary on the violence of the age. France was embroiled in the Algerian War, a brutal colonial conflict that was tearing the country apart. Violence was in the air. On the television, in the newspapers. Saint-Phal's shootings took that violence and redirected it, turned it into something you could look at, something you could feel, something you could even participate in. But the shootings were also deeply personal. Saint-Phal later said that she was shooting at her own pain, at the trauma of her childhood, at the rage that had been building inside her for decades. She was shooting at the men who had hurt her, She was shooting at the society that had tried to confine her to the roles of model and wife and mother. She was shooting at the very idea that a woman's anger was something to be suppressed and hidden and ashamed of. And the art world noticed. Almost overnight, Saint-Phal became one of the most talked about artists in Paris. The extreme expressions of violence in her work, combined with her striking physical presence and her refusal to explain or apologize, made her a figure of fascination. She was featured in fashion magazines. The designer Marc Bohan at the House of Dior began creating clothes exclusively for her. Her personal style, bold and androgynous, inspired Yves Saint Laurent to create his revolutionary Le Smoking trouser suits for women in 1966. Designs that he would continue to produce for decades. But Saint-Phal was already moving beyond the shootings. In the mid-1960s, she began creating the works for which she is perhaps best known, the nanas. These were enormous, exuberant, joyfully colorful sculptures of women, round and voluptuous and unapologetically physical. They danced, they kicked their legs in the air, they took up space in a way that was both playful and defiant. If the shooting paintings had been about destruction, the nanas were about abundance, about pleasure, about the sheer, uncontainable energy of being alive in a female body. The most spectacular nana was a collaboration with Tinguely and another artist, Per Olof Oltvedet, for the Moderna Museet in Stockholm in 1966. It was a massive reclining female figure, over 80 feet long, that visitors entered through a doorway placed between her legs. Inside the figure were various installations, including a bar, a cinema, and a gallery of fake paintings. It was simultaneously a celebration of womanhood, a commentary on how women's bodies are consumed and entered and exploited, and a magnificently weird funhouse. Over 80,000 people visited in the first few weeks alone. But there was a price to all of this, a price that Saint-Phal was paying with her own body. The materials she worked with, polyester resins and fiberglass and industrial paints, were toxic. She breathed in their fumes day after day, year after year, with no protective equipment. In 1974, she collapsed with a pulmonary abscess so severe she nearly died. The damage to her lungs was permanent. She would spend the rest of her life struggling to breathe. The very materials she had used to create beauty and joy and liberation slowly killing her from the inside. It is one of the cruelest ironies in the history of modern art. A woman who had used art to survive her pain, who had channeled rage into creation, who had built monuments to joy that towered over gallery floors and public squares, was being destroyed by the physical act of making. The medium that saved her was also the medium that consumed her, and yet she never stopped. She kept building, she kept creating, she kept insisting that art was not a quiet contemplation, but a full body, full life, all-or-nothing act. But Saint-Phal and the Nouveau Realists were not the only ones rewriting the rules in 1960s Paris. Just across the neighborhood, in the same cafes and sometimes at the same tables, another revolution was unfolding. This one did not involve paintbrushes or rifles or self-destroying machines. It involved something much more powerful, a camera. If you had walked into a certain small cinema on the left bank in the spring of 1960 and watched a film called Breathless, you would have experienced something that had never quite happened before in the history of cinema. You would have watched a movie that felt like it was being invented in front of your eyes. The film was directed by a young man named Jean-Luc Godard, who was 29 years old, who had never directed a feature film before, and who did not bother to write a proper screenplay. Instead, he showed up each morning on location, usually somewhere on the streets of Paris, and wrote that day's dialogue on scraps of paper, sometimes handing the actors their lines mere minutes before the camera rolled. He filmed with a handheld camera, often held by a cinematographer sitting in a wheelchair being pushed down the sidewalk, because they could not afford the elaborate tracking equipment that a professional studio would have used. He used natural light because artificial lighting rigs were too expensive, and when the finished film turned out to be 30 minutes too long, he did something that no respectable filmmaker would have considered. Instead of cutting out entire scenes, He instructed his editors to cut within each scene, removing small pieces from the middle of shots and pasting the remaining fragments together. The result was a visual technique called the jump cut, where the image seems to stutter and leap forward in time, as if the film itself is impatient, is bored with continuity, is in too much of a hurry to bother with smooth transitions. Breathless starred Jean-Paul Belmondo as a petty criminal who kills a policeman and then wanders around Paris with his American girlfriend, played by Jean Seberg, talking about movies and love and death while smoking cigarettes and looking effortlessly cool. The story, based on an idea by Godard's friend François Truffaut, was thin almost to the point of transparency. But the style was unlike anything audiences had ever seen. It was fast, it was loose, it was jazzy, it was alive. Belmondo's character spoke directly to the camera. He mimicked Humphrey Bogart. He seemed to exist not in a carefully constructed fictional world, but in the actual city of Paris, walking its real streets, sitting in its real cafes, breathing its real air. When Breathless premiered, the response was immediate and divided. Some critics hated it. The New York Times reviewer described it as a pictorial cacophony. Others recognized it for what it was, a complete reinvention of what cinema could be. Godard had not merely made a film, he had made a statement. He had proved that a movie could be shot for almost nothing, on the streets, with borrowed equipment and friends as actors, and still be more exciting, more alive, more genuinely cinematic than anything coming out of the big studios. And Godard was not alone. He was part of a group of young French film critics who had spent the 1950s watching movies obsessively, arguing about them passionately, and writing about them in a magazine called Cahiers du Cinéma. Founded in 1951 by the influential critic André Bazin, Cahiers had become the most important film publication in the world, a place where ideas about cinema were debated with the intensity and seriousness usually reserved for philosophy or theology. The young critics who wrote for Cahiers, Godard, Truffaut, Claude Chabrol, Eric Romer, Jacques Rivette were not content to merely analyze films. They wanted to make them. They had watched thousands of movies at the Cinémathèque Française, the great film archive in Paris, where its founder, Henri Langlois, screened everything from Hollywood westerns to Japanese masterpieces to forgotten silent films. They had developed strong, often contradictory opinions about what made a great film, and they had developed an idea that would change the way people thought about movies forever. They called it the politique des auteurs, or as the American critic Andrew Sarris would later translate it, the auteur theory. The idea was simple but revolutionary. The true author of a film was not the screenwriter, not the producer, not the studio. It was the director. A great director stamped every frame with their personal vision, their obsessions, their style. Alfred Hitchcock was not merely a craftsman who assembled suspense stories. He was an artist with a coherent worldview that expressed itself across the entire body of his work. The same was true of Howard Hawks, of John Ford, of Fritz Lang. The director was the auteur, the author, the creative intelligence behind the work. Armed with this conviction, the Cahiers critics set out to prove their theory by becoming directors themselves. And the results, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, were extraordinary. Truffaut's first feature, The 400 Blows, premiered at the Cannes Film Festival in 1959 and won the award for Best Director. It was a semi-autobiographical film about a 12-year-old boy named Antoine Doinel, who is neglected by his parents, misunderstood by his teachers, and ultimately sent to a juvenile detention center. The film was shot in the streets of Paris with a freedom and intimacy that made the viewer feel they were walking beside the boy, sharing his confusion and his loneliness. It ended with one of the most famous shots in cinema history, a freeze frame of Antoine's face as he reaches the ocean for the first time, looking directly into the camera with an expression that is simultaneously hopeful and afraid, a boy who has run as far as he can and has no idea what happens next. That final frame was something new. Freeze frames had been used before, but never with this emotional precision, never as a way of trapping a human face at the exact moment of uncertainty between freedom and fear. It is still, more than 60 years later, one of the most discussed and analyzed images in the history of cinema. Chabrol had actually beaten Truffaut to the punch, releasing Le Beau Serge in 1958, a dark drama set in a decaying rural village. But it was Truffaut and Godard who captured the public imagination and who became, in the eyes of the world, the faces of what was now being called the Nouvelle Vague, the New Wave. The movement went beyond just the Cahiers group. There was also what critics called the Left Bank School, a slightly older, more politically engaged group of filmmakers who worked alongside the New Wave but maintained their own identity. Alain Resnais, who had already made one of the most devastating films about the Holocaust, with Night and Fog, released Hiroshima Mon Amour in 1959, a film about memory and desire and the impossibility of truly understanding another person's suffering. Agnes Varda, who was among the earliest of the New Wave directors, though she was often overlooked in favor of her male colleagues, had made her first feature, La Pointe Courte, back in 1955, anticipating many of the techniques the Cahiers directors would later be credited with inventing. And there was Chris Marker, perhaps the most mysterious of all the left bank filmmakers. Marker, who operated under a pseudonym and refused to be photographed, made essay films that blurred the line between documentary and fiction, between image and text, between cinema and philosophy. His masterpiece, La Jetée, released in 1962, was composed almost entirely of still photographs. It told the story of a man haunted by a memory from his childhood, a memory of a woman's face at an airport, and it explored the nature of time and memory with a poetic intensity that still astonishes. What connected all of these filmmakers, both the right bank Cahiers group and the left bank school, was their relationship to Paris itself. The city was not merely a backdrop for their stories, it was a character. It breathed and moved and changed with the light. Godard filmed Belmondo walking down the Champs-Élysées, and the boulevard became charged with meaning, became a statement about freedom and modernity, and the electricity of being young in a great city. The camera caught the reflections in shop windows, the rush of traffic, the way pedestrians glanced at each other and then looked away. The city was not dressed up or art-directed for the camera. It was simply there, in all its beautiful indifference, and the fact that Godard let it be itself, let it be noisy and chaotic and unpredictable, was itself a revolutionary act. Truffaut's camera followed Antoine Doinel through the narrow streets of Montmartre, and the viewer could feel the cold, could smell the bakeries, could hear the sounds of a neighborhood that was still in the late 1950s, a working-class village in the middle of a great metropolis. The staircases and the alleyways and the small parks where children played became the architecture of a childhood, and Truffaut filmed them with such tenderness that even the dingiest apartment block seemed to glow with emotional significance. Varda filmed Paris as a woman experienced it, which was to say, with attention to the details that male directors often missed, the textures, the colors, the small moments of connection and disconnection that make up a life lived in a city. She noticed the way light fell on the faces of market vendors in the morning. She noticed the way women walked differently when they thought no one was watching. Her gaze was warmer than Godard's, less cynical than Chabrol's, but just as sharp. And her insistence on filming the lives of ordinary women, not starlets or ingenues, but real women with real concerns, was quietly radical in a movement that was often dominated by male fantasies. Jacques Demy, who was Varda's husband and who straddled the line between the Cahiers group and the left bank, brought yet another vision of Paris to the screen. His films, often musicals, were drenched in color and romance, and yet beneath the bright surfaces there was always an undertow of melancholy, a sense that the beautiful moments were already passing even as you watched them. His Umbrellas of Cherbourg was not set in Paris, but captured something essentially Parisian in its mixture of beauty and sadness, its understanding that love and loss are not opposites but companions. The New Wave filmmakers were not working in isolation from the other artistic revolutions happening in Paris. They drank in the same cafes as the Nouveau Realistes. They attended the same gallery openings. Godard compared his own filmmaking style to action painting, the technique of mid-century artists like Jackson Pollock, who worked with spontaneity and physical gesture. He wanted, he said, to make action cinema the way there was action painting. You do not really know where you are going with it. You splatter it on a canvas, or in his case, on film. And the connections went deeper than shared habits. The New Wave and the art underground shared a fundamental belief. They both insisted that art had to stop imitating life at a safe distance and start engaging with life directly, messily, honestly. They both rejected the idea that culture was something created by professionals in controlled environments and delivered to a passive audience. They both believed that the streets, the cafes, the apartments, the ordinary spaces of everyday existence were the proper territory of art. But while the filmmakers and the Nouveau Realists were busy reinventing cinema and challenging the gallery system, another group, much smaller, much more secretive, and ultimately much more dangerous, was brewing something far more radical. They were not interested in making new kinds of art. They were interested in abolishing art altogether and replacing it with revolution. The man at the center of this group was named Guy Debord, and he was, depending on whom you asked, either the most brilliant thinker in Paris or the most insufferable one, possibly both. Debord was born in Paris in 1931, and his life was marked from the beginning by loss. His father, a pharmacist, died when Debord was young, and his mother sent him to live with his grandmother in Italy. He grew up restless, angry, and brilliantly articulate, the kind of person who could take apart any argument with surgical precision and who seemed to experience the modern world as a personal insult. In 1951, at the age of 19, Debord arrived in the Latin Quarter of Paris and fell in with a group called the Lettrists, a post-war avant-garde movement that wanted to fuse poetry and music and reinvent the urban landscape. Led by a Romanian artist named Isidore Iso, the Lettrists were provocative and attention-seeking, but Debord quickly grew bored with what he saw as their superficiality. He wanted something deeper, something more dangerous. He spent much of his time at a bar called Chez Moineau, where he met the people who would become his closest collaborators. Michelle Bernstein, who would become his first wife, Gil J. Woolman, a fellow radical, and a revolving cast of drinkers, arguers, and would-be revolutionaries who shared Debord's conviction that modern society was fundamentally broken and that art, in its current form, was part of the problem. In 1957, Debord and several allies from across Europe met in a small Italian town and founded the Situationist International. The name came from Debord's central idea, which was that the goal of revolutionary activity was to create situations, moments of life deliberately constructed to shatter the numbness of everyday existence and to reawaken people to the authentic experience of being alive. It sounds abstract, and in many ways it was, but the ideas behind the Situationist International were among the most powerful and prescient of the 20th century. At the heart of everything Debord wrote was a single concept, the spectacle. In his 1967 book, The Society of the Spectacle, Debord argued that modern capitalism had accomplished something unprecedented in human history. It had turned all of lived experience into a passive show. People no longer actually lived their lives. They watched representations of life on television, in advertisements, in the carefully constructed images of happiness and success that saturated every corner of modern culture. Everything that was once directly lived, Debord wrote, had moved into representation. The spectacle was not simply a collection of images. It was a social relationship between people, mediated by images. It was the way that consumer capitalism transformed every human desire, every human need, every human connection into a commodity to be bought and sold. You did not fall in love. You purchased the products that signified love. You did not enjoy a meal with friends. You consumed the brand experience of dining. You did not live. You spectated. This critique would prove to be devastatingly accurate as a prediction of the media-saturated world that was to come. Debord was essentially describing social media and influencer culture 60 years before they existed. He was describing a world in which the image of a life has replaced the life itself, in which people perform their existence rather than experiencing it. But Debord did not stop at analysis. He wanted action. And the Situationists developed a set of tools and techniques designed to disrupt the spectacle and create cracks in its surface through which authentic experience might flood back in. The first was the derive or drift. This was a technique of walking through the city without a destination, without a map, without a purpose, allowing yourself to be pulled by the emotional currents of the urban environment. The point was not to go somewhere. The point was to experience the city as a living, breathing organism, with its own moods and textures and hidden zones of attraction and repulsion. Think of it this way. You step out of a cafe on a Tuesday afternoon with no plan and no appointment. Instead of heading toward the metro or turning toward your apartment, you let the city guide you. A narrow street lined with chestnut trees pulls you south. You follow it, not because it leads anywhere useful, but because something about the quality of the light and the sound of your footsteps on the cobblestones feels right. You turn a corner and find yourself in a small square you have never noticed before, with a fountain that has not worked in years and a bench where an old man is reading a newspaper. You sit for a while, then something draws you onward. Perhaps the smell of bread from an open window, perhaps the distant sound of a church bell, perhaps simply a feeling, an itch to see what is around the next corner. And you go, and you keep going. For hours, sometimes, wandering the city as if you were reading it like a book, letting it reveal its hidden narratives, its forgotten passages, its secret emotional geography. Debord created maps of Paris in which the city was sliced into fragments and rearranged, the familiar geography shattered and reassembled according to emotional logic rather than physical proximity. These psychogeographic maps showed neighborhoods floating like islands, connected by red arrows that traced the paths of desire and curiosity rather than the routes of buses and trains. They were beautiful objects in themselves, and they proposed a radical idea that the city you think you know, the city of street names and arrondissements and metro lines, is not the real city. The real city is the one you discover when you stop trying to get somewhere and start paying attention to where you already are. The second was détournement, which might be translated as hijacking or diversion. This was the technique of taking an existing cultural product, an advertisement, a film, a political slogan, a work of art, and altering it in a way that reversed or subverted its original meaning. A glossy advertisement for luxury goods could be rewritten to reveal the exploitation behind the glamour. A Hollywood film could be re-edited with a new soundtrack that exposed the ideological assumptions hidden in its narrative. Détournement was cultural guerrilla warfare, and it would later inspire everything from punk rock album covers to the culture jamming of the 90s to the meme culture of today. The Situationists were not gentle provocateurs. They were aggressive, confrontational, and often deliberately offensive. In 1958, they raided an international art conference in Belgium, showering the audience with pamphlets and generating headlines and arrests. They published a journal, International Situationist, 12 issues between 1958 and 1969, filled with dense theoretical essays and blistering attacks on everyone they considered complicit in the spectacle, which was almost everyone. Debord himself was brilliant but autocratic. He demanded absolute loyalty from the members of the Situationist International and expelled anyone who deviated from his vision. Over the course of the movement's existence, it attracted more than 70 members from across Europe, but Debord's purges were relentless. Members were kicked out for making art that Debord considered too conventional, for collaborating with galleries, for publishing in the wrong magazines, for any perceived betrayal of the movement's revolutionary purity. The Danish painter Asger Jorn, one of the founding members and a genuinely talented artist, eventually left in frustration. The French theorist Raoul Vaneigem, who wrote the movement's other major text, The Revolution of Everyday Life, was also eventually expelled, and he responded with a scorching critique of Debord's authoritarianism. At any given time, the actual membership of the Situationist International was tiny. sometimes fewer than a dozen people. They were, by any conventional measure, marginal, a handful of intellectuals publishing obscure journals and arguing with each other in cafes. And yet their ideas were spreading, through the journals, through word of mouth, through the electric network of radical thought that ran through the universities and the student organizations of 1960s France. By the mid-1960s, Situationist pamphlets were circulating on campuses across France. One of the most influential was a short text published in 1966 called On the Poverty of Student Life, which attacked the complacency of university students with a ferocity and wit that made it irresistible. Students who had never heard of the Situationist International read the pamphlet and felt as though someone had finally put into words the formless anger and dissatisfaction they had been carrying around for years. The slogans were being written, the ideas were being absorbed, and somewhere in the background, like a fuse burning slowly toward a pile of dynamite, something enormous was building. It would take a few more years. It would take a series of events that no one fully predicted and no one fully controlled. But when it finally detonated, it would shake Paris to its core. And it would start, as it so often does in the history of revolution, with something absurdly small, with a swimming pool, a rude comment to a government minister, and a group of young people who were told they could not visit each other's dormitories after 11 o'clock at night. But that story is coming. First, there is another layer of this city to explore, a layer that is literally, physically, beneath everything else, because Paris was not just a city of streets and cafes and galleries, it was a city built on a hollow, and in the darkness below, a different kind of underground was coming to life. Here is something most people do not know about Paris. The city is hollow. Beneath the elegant boulevards and the grand apartments and the cobblestone streets, there are more than 300 kilometers of abandoned tunnels and quarries, a vast underground labyrinth carved out over 5 centuries of digging. The stone that built Paris came from beneath Paris, the limestone blocks that went into the construction of Notre Dame, the Louvre, the grand Haussmann buildings with their iron balconies and zinc roofs. All of it was quarried from beneath the city's own feet, and when the quarrying stopped, the tunnels remained, empty, dark, and forbidden. The French government created a special agency called the Inspection Générale des Carrières, the General Inspectorate of Quarries, whose job was to map these tunnels, monitor their stability, and keep people out. Because the tunnels were dangerous. Ceilings could collapse. You could get lost in the darkness and wander for hours without finding your way back. The air could be bad. And yet, despite the danger and despite the laws that made unauthorized entry a punishable offense, people kept going down. They were called cataphiles, and they were as varied a group as you could imagine. Geologists who wanted to study the rock formations, history enthusiasts drawn by the centuries of human marks left on the quarry walls, thrill seekers who were attracted precisely because it was forbidden, and artists, always artists. The walls of the Paris quarries are covered in art, centuries of it, incised inscriptions dating back to the 1700s, graffiti from students and soldiers and lovers, elaborate painted murals, sculptures carved directly into the stone, mosaic installations assembled from tiles carried down in backpacks. The artwork spans the full range of Parisian history, from the upheaval of the French Revolution, through the chaos of the Commune, through both world wars and into the student revolts of the 1960s. Every major convulsion in the life of the city above was recorded, in one way or another, on the walls of the city below. During the 1960s, the cataphile community took on a new energy. The same spirit of rebellion that was animating the art world above ground found its way underground. Quite literally, young people who rejected the conformity of post-war French society discovered in the quarries a space that belonged to no one, a space beyond the reach of authority and convention, where you could create whatever you wanted without permission and without consequence. They held parties down there, gatherings lit by candles and battery-powered lanterns, the warm yellow light flickering across limestone walls that had not seen the sun in centuries. They played music, guitars and accordions, and sometimes small portable record players. the sound carrying through the stone corridors in strange echoing waves that made a single instrument sound like an orchestra. They brought wine and bread and cheese and ate sitting on the cold stone floors, their laughter bouncing off the low ceilings. They painted murals that no gallery would ever exhibit, enormous and intricate works that might take weeks to complete, requiring multiple trips underground with cans of paint smuggled past police patrols. They created installations that no critic would ever review, arrangements of found objects and carved stone and carefully placed lights that transformed dead-end chambers into something closer to chapels. Imagine being one of these cataphiles. You have made your way to a hidden entrance, perhaps a forgotten drain cover or a breach in a cellar wall, and you have lowered yourself into the darkness. The temperature drops immediately. The air is cool and damp and smells of old stone and earth. The sounds of the city above, the traffic, the voices, the rhythm of millions of lives being lived, all of it fades as you move deeper into the tunnels. Your flashlight carves a narrow path through the blackness. The walls on either side of you are close enough to touch, and when you do, the stone is smooth and cold under your fingers, worn by the hands of quarrymen who worked these passages 200 years ago. And then you turn a corner, and your flashlight falls on a mural. Somebody has been here before you. Somebody has spent hours, maybe days, painting a scene on this wall that only a handful of people will ever see. And the quality of the work is astonishing. Not the crude scrawlings of a vandal, but the careful, considered work of someone who takes their art seriously, who has chosen this wall in this forgotten tunnel as their canvas not because they have no other option, but because this is where the work belongs. In the dark, in the silence, away from everything. The underground became, for a certain kind of Parisian, the truest expression of the city's creative spirit. A place where art existed for its own sake, unmediated by commerce or criticism or the desire for recognition. Just paint on stone in the dark, seen only by those willing to risk arrest and navigate labyrinthian passages to find it. The cataphiles communicated with each other through paper tracts, handwritten or mimeographed leaflets that they left in the tunnels for others to find. These tracts served as a kind of underground newspaper, announcing gatherings, sharing maps of newly discovered passages, debating the ethics of their trespass. Over time, the tracts became an art form of their own, decorated with drawings and designs imbued with the personality of their authors. There is something deeply poignant about the parallel between what was happening above and below the streets of Paris in the 1960s. Above, artists were declaring the death of traditional art and trying to build something new from the wreckage. Below, other artists were creating in total anonymity, in total darkness, with no audience and no market and no possibility of fame. Both were acts of defiance. Both were refusals to accept the world as it was presented to them. And both were, in their own way, profoundly hopeful. Because to create something beautiful in a place where no one may ever see it is an act of faith. It says that the act of creation itself has value, regardless of who witnesses it. The cataphile tradition continues to this day. People still descend, illegally, into the quarries beneath Paris. They still paint on the walls, they still leave their tracts. The Inspection Générale des Carrières still patrols, still issues fines, still tries to keep people out. And the cat-and-mouse game goes on, as it has for generations, beneath the feet of a city that has always had secrets. But now it is time to return to the surface, because the long fuse that had been burning through the 1960s, the one lit by the Situationists and fed by student frustration and stoked by a generation that felt suffocated by the rigidity of French society, that fuse was about to reach its destination. And when it did, it would produce the largest explosion Paris had seen since the liberation from the Nazis. It began, of all places, at a swimming pool. In 1967, at the University of Nanterre, a campus on the dull outskirts of Paris, students had been protesting about something that would seem almost comically trivial by the standards of what was to come. They wanted boys to be allowed to visit the girls' dormitories. The university had strict rules prohibiting male students from entering female residences after 11 at night, and women could only visit the men's building if they were at least 21 years old. Guardhouses had been set up to enforce these rules. The students, who were part of a generation that had grown up on rock and roll and the sexual revolution and the promise of personal freedom, found these rules absurd. In January 1968, the French Minister of Youth and Sports, a man named François Missoff, came to Nanterre to dedicate a new swimming pool. A red-haired student named Daniel Cohn-Bendit confronted him publicly, complaining that the minister's department had produced a thick report on French youth that said nothing at all about their sexual frustrations. Missoff, taken aback, suggested that Cohn-Bendit jump in the pool to cool off. Cohn-Bendit shot back that the minister's response was exactly what one would expect from a fascist regime. It was a small moment, a confrontation between a young hothead and a bewildered government official at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. But it made Cohn-Bendit famous overnight. He became an anti-authoritarian icon, a symbol of a generation's refusal to be patronized. And the confrontation marked the beginning of a chain of events that would, within a few months, bring France to the edge of something that many people on both sides of the barricades genuinely believed might be a revolution. Throughout the spring of 1968, tensions escalated at Nanterre. Student protesters occupied buildings, authorities threatened expulsions. On May 2nd, the university's dean shut Nanterre down entirely. The next day, students from Nanterre travelled across Paris to the Sorbonne to hold a protest meeting. Police invaded the Sorbonne, and what had been an internal university dispute suddenly became a confrontation between students and the state. On May 6th, the National Student Union and the Union of University Teachers called a march to protest the police action. More than 20,000 students, teachers and supporters marched towards the sealed-off Sorbonne. Police charged, batons fell, the crowd scattered, then regrouped, then began tearing up paving stones and building barricades. The barricades were primitive, made of overturned cars and construction materials and anything else that could be dragged into the street, but they were real. Paris had not seen barricades since the Commune of 1871. Over the next 2 weeks, the situation escalated beyond anything anyone had imagined. Night after night, the streets of the Latin Quarter, the ancient student district on the left bank, were filled with running battles between students and police. Tear gas drifted through the narrow medieval streets, seeping under doorways and through window cracks, sending residents who had nothing to do with the protests coughing and stumbling through their own apartments with wet towels pressed to their faces. Shop windows shattered, cars were overturned and set ablaze, and the orange light of the fires reflected off the facades of buildings that had stood for centuries and had never seen anything quite like this. The sound of sirens and shouting and breaking glass became the soundtrack of the city. Radio stations broadcast live from the streets, their reporters breathless and incredulous, describing scenes that seemed to belong to a different century. Listeners across France gathered around their radios late into the night, hearing the crackle of tear gas canisters, the roar of crowds, the dull thud of police batons on flesh. For many French families, it was the first time they had ever heard their own country sound like a war zone. Mothers worried about sons and daughters who had gone to the Sorbonne to study literature and were now pulling up paving stones in the middle of the night. Fathers who had lived through the occupation wondered aloud whether the Republic itself was coming apart. The barricades became a kind of communal art project, chaotic and improvised, and strangely beautiful in their desperation. Students who had never lifted anything heavier than a textbook were dragging iron gates and cafe tables and planks of wood into the middle of the street, stacking them into walls that would not have stopped a determined army, but that served as powerful symbols of refusal. Behind the barricades, strangers shared cigarettes and bottles of water and traded rumors about what the government would do next. There was fear, yes, but there was also exhilaration. For many of the young people on those streets, this was the most alive they had ever felt. And then something happened that transformed the student protest into something far larger and far more dangerous. The workers joined in. On May 13th, a general strike was called, and it spread factory after factory, office after office, institution after institution. Workers who had grievances of their own about wages, about working conditions, about the rigid hierarchy of French labor relations, saw the student uprising as an opening, a crack in the wall of authority through which decades of frustration could pour. It started in the provinces at a factory near Nantes in Brittany, where workers walked out and occupied their workplace. The news travelled fast. Within days, auto workers in the suburbs of Paris had joined, then the postal workers, then the railway workers, then the civil servants, then the bank clerks. Then, in a move that stunned everyone, the employees of the National Broadcasting Service went on strike, which meant that the French government lost control of its own television and radio stations at the very moment it needed them most. Within a week, more than 10 million people were on strike. 10 million. In a country of 50 million, France ground to a halt in a way that is difficult to comprehend unless you have lived through something similar. Trains stopped running. No mail was delivered. Factories fell silent, their machinery cold and still. Garbage piled up in the streets because the sanitation workers were out. Petrol stations ran dry because the refineries were closed. Shops began to ration food. The banks were shut. The country looked and felt as if someone had simply reached over and turned it off. For a few extraordinary weeks, normal life was suspended. Time itself seemed to bend. People who had spent their entire adult lives following the same routine, waking at the same hour, catching the same desk, suddenly found themselves standing in the street with nothing to do and nowhere to go, and a strange, disorienting freedom that was equal parts terrifying and exhilarating. Students and factory workers who had never spoken to each other before found themselves sitting on the same occupied factory floors, sharing food and cigarettes and ideas, discovering that they had more in common than they had ever been told. And on the walls of Paris, the slogans appeared. They were everywhere. Spray-painted on the facades of grand buildings, scrawled in chalk on the sidewalks, printed on thousands of silk-screened posters that appeared overnight as if by magic. And many of the most powerful, most memorable slogans came directly from the writings of the Situationists. Under the cobblestones, the beach. This was a reference to the paving stones that students were pulling up to throw at police, and beneath those stones, a layer of sand. But it was also a metaphor for the idea that beneath the hard surface of everyday reality, something freer, something more beautiful, was waiting to be uncovered. Never work, straight from the Situationist playbook, a rejection not just of exploitation, but of the entire concept of wage labor as the organizing principle of human existence. Live without dead time, an exhortation to refuse the numbness, to insist on being fully present, fully alive in every moment. Free the passions, be realistic, demand the impossible. It is forbidden to forbid. These slogans had a literary quality, a poetic compression, that set them apart from ordinary political rhetoric. They were not demands. They were provocations. They were invitations to imagine a different world, delivered in a language so vivid and so concise that it lodged in the memory and refused to be dislodged. Meanwhile, inside the occupied École des Beaux-Arts, the National School of Fine Arts, a group of students and artists had seized the lithography studios and began producing posters at an extraordinary rate. They called themselves the Atelier Populaire, the People's Workshop, and they worked around the clock, designing and printing images that would become some of the most iconic political artwork of the 20th century. The posters were bold, graphic, immediate. A silhouetted riot police officer with the slogan, "Beauty is in the street," a factory chimney belching smoke in the shape of a fist, an outline of Charles de Gaulle's head with tape over his mouth. These images were pasted on walls all over Paris, and they served as a visual language for a movement that was moving too fast for traditional media to keep up. The Atelier Populaire operated on strict principles of collective creation. No individual was credited. Every design was debated and voted on in open assemblies. The posters belonged to no one and everyone. This was art in the service of the people, and the people were invited to take it, copy it, distribute it, paste it on any wall they saw fit. Even the world of cinema was drawn into the maelstrom. At the Cannes Film Festival, which was underway when the uprising erupted, Godard and Truffaut led a group of filmmakers in shutting down the festival in solidarity with the students and workers. Godard, who had once been a rebellious young critic writing cheeky reviews for a film magazine, was now standing on a stage at the most prestigious film festival in the world, physically preventing a screening from taking place, shouting that there was not a single film showing that represented the cause of the workers and students. Not one, whether by Milos or myself or Roman or Francois, we are behind the times. The crisis peaked in late May. President Charles de Gaulle, who had ruled France with monarchical authority for a decade, seemed to lose his nerve. On May 29th, he vanished from Paris without explanation. For several hours, no one knew where he was. The government appeared on the verge of collapse. There were genuine fears, or hopes depending on where you stood, that France was experiencing a full-scale revolution. De Gaulle had gone to Baden-Baden, Germany, to consult with General Jacques Massu, the commander of French forces stationed there. He wanted assurance that the military would support him if it came to it, if troops were needed to retake Paris from the revolutionaries. Would Massu stand behind him? Massu said yes. De Gaulle returned to Paris the next day, his nerve restored, and gave a radio address that was a masterpiece of political theatre. He dissolved the National Assembly, called new elections, and rallied his supporters with a simple, powerful message. The Republic was in danger, and order must be restored. It worked. On May 30th, nearly 1 million people marched through the streets of Paris in support of de Gaulle. They were the silent majority who had watched the preceding weeks with alarm. The shopkeepers and civil servants and retired generals and anxious parents who feared chaos more than they desired change. The counter-demonstration was massive, and it broke the spell. Within days, the workers began returning to their factories. The government offered concessions. A significant increase in the minimum wage, improved working conditions, greater union rights. The students, who had been the spark that ignited everything, were left standing in emptying streets, wondering what had happened to their revolution. By June, the barricades were gone. The tear gas had dissipated. The posters were peeling off the walls. De Gaulle's party won a landslide in the elections that followed. On the surface, it appeared that the uprising had been defeated, that the old order had held. But appearances, as the Situationists had always insisted, are deceptive, because what May 1968 accomplished was not a political revolution, it was something deeper and, in its own way, more lasting. It was a cultural transformation so profound that French society emerged from it almost unrecognizable. Practically overnight, the rigid hierarchies that had defined French social life for generations began to crack. Universities were reformed. Students gained a voice in how their institutions were run. The relationship between employer and employee shifted. Women's rights advanced. Sexual mores loosened. The stuffy, paternalistic France of de Gaulle gave way to something more open, more questioning, more willing to challenge authority. The artistic repercussions rippled outward for decades. The posters of the Atelier Populaire influenced an entire tradition of political graphic design, from punk album covers in the 1970s to the work of street artists like Banksy and Shepard Fairey in the 21st century. The Situationist slogans, dismissed at the time as youthful graffiti, proved to be among the most durable and prescient statements of their century. Debord's concept of the spectacle became a foundational text for anyone trying to understand the relationship between media, capitalism, and lived experience. But the aftermath was not all triumph. For many of the individuals who had been at the center of the decade's creative upheavals, the years that followed brought isolation, disillusionment, and loss. The Situationist International did not survive the decade it had done so much to define. Debord, as autocratic as ever, expelled the remaining members one by one. In 1972, he formally dissolved the organization. He retreated to a cottage in rural France with his second wife, Alice Beckerhoe, and spent the following years reading military strategy, drinking heavily, and corresponding with a shrinking circle of allies. He suffered from depression and from a form of nerve damage linked to his alcoholism. In 1994, at the age of 62, Debord took his own life. the French press, which had spent 30 years ignoring or mocking the Situationist International, suddenly discovered that they had a genius in their midst and began the work of turning Debord into exactly the kind of cultural spectacle he had spent his life fighting against. Nouveau Realisme officially ended in 1970. Resteni organized a final exhibition to mark the movement's 10th anniversary, and then the artists went their separate ways. Klein was already 8 years dead. Tinguely continued building his wonderful absurd machines until his death in 1991. Armand kept accumulating. Spoeri kept trapping. The new wave filmmakers also diverged. Godard, radicalized by May 1968, abandoned mainstream cinema entirely. He formed a collective called the Ziga Vertov Group with a collaborator named Jean-Pierre Gaurin, and spent the early 1970s making fiercely political, deliberately difficult films that almost no one saw. He was trying to escape the cult of personality that had formed around him, to become anonymous, to make political films politically. It was a noble impulse, but it also meant that one of the most brilliant filmmakers of the century effectively withdrew from public view for the better part of a decade. Truffaut took the opposite path. He continued making deeply personal, emotionally generous films, returning again and again to the character of Antoine Duenel, the boy from the 400 Blows, following him through young adulthood and love and marriage and disappointment. Truffaut's later films were not revolutionary in the way that Breathless had been, but they were humane and beautiful and beloved. When he died of a brain tumor in 1984, at the age of 52, France mourned him as one of its greatest artists. Agnes Varda, who had been there at the very beginning and who had been consistently undervalued by critics who could not see past her gender, continued working with quiet brilliance for decades. She made documentaries and fiction films and hybrid works that defied classification. She lived long enough to see the world finally recognize what she had accomplished. In her 80s, she was making films that were as playful and sharp and moving as anything she had ever done. She died in 2019 at the age of 90, having outlived nearly all of her contemporaries and having proven beyond any argument that the French New Wave was never the exclusive property of the men who had claimed it. And Saint-Germain-des-Prés, the neighborhood that had been the cradle of all of it. By the 1970s, the transformation was well underway. The cheap hotels and the scruffy studios were disappearing. The rents were climbing. The bookshops were being replaced by fashion boutiques. The cafes that had once been second homes to broke painters and unemployed philosophers were now charging prices that would have made Sartre choke on his espresso. The bohemians were being pushed out, replaced by the very consumer culture that the Situationists had warned about. The Café de Flore, where Sartre had once written for 10 hours straight on the price of a single coffee, began emphasizing its connections to famous patrons, installing plaques and raising prices to match its growing status as a cultural landmark rather than a working café. By the 1970s, a simple espresso there cost what would once have been a day's food budget for a struggling artist. The neighborhood's character was being embalmed and sold as an experience. You could sit at Sartre's table, but the conversation at that table was now about real estate prices and vacation plans rather than the nature of freedom. Alicia Drake, a writer who documented the fashion scene of 1970s Paris, described the Café de Flore as the essence of all that was desirable on the left bank of Paris, a mirrored place of entrances and encounters, and she was right. But what was desirable had changed. The encounters were no longer between philosophers arguing about existence. They were between designers comparing fabric swatches and socialites arranging lunch. It is one of the great ironies of cultural history. The rebellion of the 1960s, which had been in large part a rebellion against the commodification of life, was itself commodified. The slogans of May 1968 were printed on T-shirts. The Nouveau Realistes works, which had been made from trash and found objects, were now selling for millions in the very galleries the movement had set out to undermine. A large-scale painting by Dubuffet, one of the older Parisian artists who had inspired the younger generation, sold at auction for nearly $25 million. Soliges, who was still painting at the age of 96, saw his early works become the most sought-after items in the post-war European art market. The new wave films, which had been shot on shoestring budgets in borrowed apartments, were now treated as sacred texts in university film programs around the world. Even the catacomb art, the most underground of all the underground art, was being documented and studied and turned into coffee table books. The underground had become the establishment. The revolution had become nostalgia. And yet, there is a moment, on a warm evening, when the light in Paris turns that particular shade of gold that happens nowhere else in the world. When the shadows along the Boulevard Saint-Germain grow long and soft, and the café tables begin to fill, and the sound of conversation and clinking glasses rises like a kind of music. And if you close your eyes and listen, if you let the noise of the modern city fade for just a moment, you can almost hear it. The sound of an argument about whether painting is dead, the distant echo of a jazz trumpet rising from a cellar club, the crack of a rifle in a gallery, followed by applause, the scratch of a pen on paper as someone writes a slogan that will one day be spray-painted on the walls of a city in revolt. The artists and filmmakers and radicals of 1960s Paris did not build anything permanent. Their movements dissolved, their manifestos gathered dust, their neighborhoods were gentrified beyond recognition. But what they created, the ideas, the images, the questions, the refusal to accept the world as it was presented to them, all of that endures. It endures in the way we think about art, in the way we think about film, in the way we think about the relationship between culture and power, in the way a single person, armed with nothing more than an idea and the courage to express it, can challenge an entire system and, for a brief, glorious, terrifying moment, make it tremble. They showed us that the most powerful art does not hang quietly on a wall. It breaks out of the gallery. It spills into the street. It changes how people see the world around them. And sometimes, just sometimes, it changes the world itself. The lights are low now, and the city is settling into sleep. The cafes are closing, the last conversations of the evening are winding down to murmurs. Somewhere beneath the streets, in the darkness of the quarries, someone may be painting a mural on a limestone wall that nobody else will ever see. And that is okay, because the act of creation itself, the stubborn, beautiful, irrational insistence on making something out of nothing, on leaving a mark in the darkness, on saying, I was here, I saw this, I felt this, I made this. That act is enough. It has always been enough. Thank you so much for joining me tonight, dear friends. If you enjoyed this journey through the hidden world of 1960s Paris, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It helps the channel grow, and it helps more people find these stories. And if you have thoughts, or memories, or connections to anything we talked about tonight, leave them in the comments. I love hearing from you. Rest well tonight, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.